The flight attendant who shattered Keisha's jaw had no idea the random passenger in seat 2A held the power to end her career forever. But when he stood up, the entire plane went silent. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to smash that subscribe button for more. Also, share your thoughts, and let me know where you're watching from. Tomorrow's story is going to be just as epic, so don't miss out. Now, let's continue. The scream that shattered the quiet hum of Flight 447 wasn't from turbulence. It was from a 23-year-old nursing student named Keisha Williams hitting the aircraft floor, her jaw hanging at an unnatural angle, blood pooling beneath her beautiful dark skin. What happened in the next 60 seconds would destroy careers, expose decades of systemic racism, and prove that sometimes justice wears a three-piece suit and carries a federal gavel. But to understand how we got here, how a routine flight from Atlanta to Chicago became a courtroom battleground that would make national headlines, we need to go back to that Tuesday morning when Keisha Williams, armed with nothing but her nursing textbooks and dreams of saving lives, stepped onto an airplane and walked straight into a nightmare she never saw coming. The flight attendant who would change her life forever was standing just 10 feet away, polishing wine glasses with hands that had no idea they were about to commit a federal crime. And the man in seat 2A, quietly reading his legal brief behind wire-rimmed glasses, had no clue he was about to become the most important witness in a case that would rock the aviation industry to its core. What do you think happened next? Have you ever witnessed injustice on a flight? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe because this story is about to take some incredible turns. The morning started like any other for Keisha Williams. At 23, she stood 5 feet 6 inches with warm brown eyes that sparkled with intelligence, her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun that framed her heart-shaped face. Her grandmother's gold cross pendant caught the morning light as she double-checked her carry-on bag outside Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, making sure her medical textbooks were secure. She was heading to Chicago for a nursing conference that could change her career trajectory forever. Keisha's fingers trembled slightly as she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent. Flight 447 to Chicago, her first time flying alone, her first major nursing conference, her first real step toward the dream that had kept her studying until 3 a.m. for the past 4 years. She'd saved every penny from her part-time job at the hospital to afford this trip, even skipping meals some weeks. Seat 14C, the agent smiled warmly. Have a wonderful flight. 3 rows ahead of where Keisha would sit, Federal Judge Harrison Mitchell was already settled in seat 2A, his silver hair perfectly combed, his 58-year-old frame draped in a navy suit that spoke of quiet authority. At 6 feet 1 inch with piercing gray eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he'd spent 30 years on the federal bench, but today he was just another passenger, reading through case files for Monday's hearing. His weathered hands, which had signed countless verdicts, now held a brief about civil rights violations, ironic, considering what he was about to witness. But it was the woman in the galley who would set everything in motion. Rebecca Martinez had been a flight attendant for Transatlantic Airways for 12 years. At 45, her blonde hair was always pulled into a perfect chignon, her makeup flawless, her smile practiced. But beneath that polished exterior lurked something darker, a resentment that had been festering since her divorce, since her promotion was passed over, since the world seemed to keep giving opportunities to people she believed didn't deserve them. Rebecca watched through the small galley window as passengers filed aboard, her blue eyes narrowing as she spotted Keisha making her way down the aisle. The young woman's natural hair, her confident stride, the way she carried herself, something about it irritated Rebecca in a way she couldn't quite articulate, or perhaps didn't want to. Keisha found her seat and carefully stowed her bag in the overhead compartment, her medical textbooks visible through the mesh pocket. An elderly white woman in the window seat, Mrs. Dorothy Chun, 72, smiled at her warmly. "First time flying?" Mrs. Chun asked, noticing Keisha's slight nervousness. "Not first time, but first time alone," Keisha replied, her voice soft and melodic with just a hint of her Georgia accent. Going to a nursing conference in Chicago. I'm specializing in pediatric care. How wonderful, Mrs. Chen beamed. The world needs more caring nurses like you, dear. Their conversation was interrupted as Rebecca Martinez appeared beside their row, her smile brittle as winter ice. Excuse me, Rebecca said, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness that flight attendants perfected. But her eyes weren't smiling. I need to check your boarding pass. Keisha looked up, confused. Oh, of course. She reached into her small purse and handed over the crumpled piece of paper. Rebecca examined it with unnecessary scrutiny, taking far longer than needed. This seat might be double-booked. You might need to move. Double-booked. Mrs. Chen interjected, frowning. But she just sat down. Her name was called at boarding. Rebecca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She wasn't used to being questioned, especially by passengers who were supposed to simply obey. Ma'am, I need you to let me handle this. Judge Mitchell, 3 rows up, lowered his reading glasses slightly. Something in the flight attendant's tone had caught his attention, that particular edge he'd heard too many times in courtrooms when prejudice was trying to dress itself up as protocol. I'm sorry, Keisha said politely, but I checked in online 12 hours ago. My seat assignment was confirmed. She pulled out her phone to show her mobile boarding pass. Rebecca didn't even look at the phone. Electronic systems make mistakes all the time. I need you to move to the back of the plane while I sort this out. The back? Mrs. Chen asked, incredulous. But this is her assigned seat. I watched her check in properly. The plane was nearly full now, the hum of conversations and settling passengers filling the cabin. But in this small section, tension was building like pressure before a storm. Keisha's heart began to race. She could feel eyes turning toward them, could sense the familiar weight of being the center of unwanted attention. Ma'am, I really don't understand the problem. My ticket is valid, my seat assignment is correct, are you arguing with me? Rebecca's voice rose just enough to cut through the cabin noise. Several passengers turned to stare. Because if you're going to be difficult, we can handle this a different way. Judge Mitchell closed his brief entirely now, his full attention focused on the scene unfolding. In 3 decades on the bench, he developed a sixth sense for injustice, and every instinct was screaming. Keisha felt her face grow warm, acutely aware that she was now the spectacle every black traveler dreaded becoming. I'm not arguing. I'm just trying to understand why I need to move when my seat assignment is correct. Your attitude is what needs to move, Rebecca snapped, her professional mask slipping completely. I've been doing this job for 12 years, and I know trouble when I see it. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Mrs. Chen gasped audibly. Judge Mitchell's hand tightened around his pen. Keisha's voice remained steady, but tears were threatening at the corners of her eyes. Trouble? Ma'am, I'm a nursing student. I'm going to a medical conference. I haven't done anything wrong. You're disrupting my cabin, Rebecca replied, her voice now carrying a warning that made several passengers shift uncomfortably. And if you don't comply with crew instructions, that's a federal offense. The threat landed like a physical blow. Keisha had never been in trouble with any authority figure in her life. She was the girl who studied while her friends partied, who worked double shifts to pay for school, who sent money home to help her grandmother with medical bills. The idea of being accused of a federal offense made her stomach lurch. I'll move, she whispered, the words barely audible. Just, please tell me where. But Rebecca Martinez had tasted power, and she wasn't done. Actually, she said, her smile returning but with a razor's edge, I think we need to discuss your attitude first. Step into the galley. Asterisk, have you ever seen injustice happen right in front of you and felt powerless to stop it? What would you have done in this moment? Share your thoughts below, and make sure you're subscribed because what happens next will shock you. Judge Mitchell watched as Keisha reluctantly stood, her hands visibly shaking now. Every fiber of his judicial training was screaming that this was wrong, but he was out of his jurisdiction here, just another passenger watching an abuse of power unfold at 30,000 feet. Mrs. Chen reached out and gently touched Keisha's arm. "Honey, you don't have to, it's okay," Keisha said softly, though her voice cracked slightly. "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. And in 30 seconds, everyone on Flight 447 would know exactly how not okay it was about to become. Keisha followed Rebecca toward the galley, her medical textbooks forgotten in the seat, her dreams of the Chicago conference fading with each step. She had no idea that she was walking toward a moment that would change not just her life, but the entire aviation industry's approach to civil rights. Behind them, Judge Mitchell quietly pulled out his phone and began recording. The galley of Flight 447 was cramped, barely 6 feet wide, with stainless steel surfaces that reflected the harsh overhead lighting like mirrors in a funhouse. Keisha found herself pressed against the beverage cart, her back to the narrow aisle, while Rebecca Martinez positioned herself between Keisha and any possible escape route back to the main cabin. The hum of the aircraft engine seemed louder here, more ominous, drowning out the distant chatter of passengers settling in for takeoff. Rebecca's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the counter as she studied Keisha with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey. "You know what I think?" Rebecca said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "I think you're one of those entitled college girls who thinks the world owes her something. Am I right?" Keisha's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "Ma'am, I just want to get to my seat and get to Chicago. I have a presentation tomorrow morning on pediatric trauma care. I've been preparing for months. Spare me the sob story," Rebecca cut her off, stepping closer. The galley suddenly felt even smaller, the walls pressing in. "You know what I've noticed? People like you always have some important place to be, some special reason why the rules shouldn't apply to you." The words hit Keisha like physical slaps, each one designed to cut deeper than the last. She could feel the familiar sting of tears threatening, but she blinked them back. Crying would only make this worse. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I just want to sit in the seat I paid for." Rebecca's laugh was sharp and humorless. "The seat you paid for? Honey, do you know how much a first-class ticket costs? Because I'm looking at your little discount boarding pass, and something doesn't add up." Keisha's confusion must have shown on her face because Rebecca's smile turned predatory. "That's right. Someone upgraded your ticket. Someone wanted little Miss Nursing Student to sit up front with the important people. The question is, who? And what did you do to earn it?" The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Keisha felt the blood drain from her face. I don't know what you're talking about. I bought my ticket online 3 weeks ago. Economy class, seat 14C. But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Had her confirmation email said first class? She'd been so nervous about the flight, so focused on her presentation, that she'd barely glanced at the seating details. Rebecca pulled out a tablet and scrolled through what appeared to be the passenger manifest. According to this, Keisha Williams was moved to seat 2B first class at 6:47 this morning. Someone with access to our booking system made that change. Someone who wanted you sitting right next to Federal Judge Harrison Mitchell. The name hit Keisha like a thunderbolt. Judge Mitchell, the man she'd glimpsed reading legal documents when she'd walked past first class. Why would anyone want her sitting next to a federal judge? She'd never even met a judge before, had never been involved in anything legal in her life. "I don't understand," she said, and the genuine confusion in her voice seemed to infuriate Rebecca even more. "Oh, you don't understand," Rebecca mimicked cruelly. "You just happened to get mysteriously upgraded to sit next to one of the most powerful federal judges in the country. What a coincidence." The flight attendant leaned closer, her breath hot against Keisha's ear. "Here's what I think happened. I think someone paid you to be here. I think this whole innocent nursing student act is a setup. Maybe you're wearing a wire, maybe you're gathering information, maybe you're part of some elaborate sting operation. But I'm going to find out." Before Keisha could protest, Rebecca's hands were on her, patting down her cardigan, checking for hidden devices. The violation was swift and thorough, Rebecca's fingers probing along Keisha's collarbone, around her waist, even checking the seams of her clothing. "Stop," Keisha gasped, trying to pull away, but there was nowhere to go in the tiny galley. "You can't, this isn't legal. I'm ensuring the safety of this aircraft," Rebecca snapped. "If you're carrying recording equipment or surveillance devices, I need to know." Her hands found Keisha's phone in her pocket and yanked it out. "Let's see what's really on here." She began scrolling through Keisha's messages, photos, emails, violating every principle of privacy with the casual indifference of someone drunk on power. Keisha watched in horror as Rebecca examined her most personal communications, texts with her grandmother about medication costs, photos from her clinical rotations at the hospital, emails about her student loan payments. "Interesting," Rebecca murmured, pausing on a message thread. "Looks like you've been in contact with someone at the Department of Justice. 3 emails in the past month." Keisha's blood ran cold. She remembered those emails now. A DOJ attorney had reached out about her volunteer work with a legal aid clinic. They were researching healthcare access in underserved communities. Completely innocent, completely legal, but in Rebecca's hands, twisted into something sinister. "Those were about a research survey," Keisha said desperately. "About healthcare disparities. I volunteer at a legal aid clinic on weekends, and they what?" Rebecca's eyes gleamed with triumph. "They recruited you for this mission? Did they tell you to act confused and innocent when you got caught?" The accusation was so outrageous, so disconnected from reality, that Keisha actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that escaped before she could stop it. That laugh was the match that lit the fuse. Rebecca's face contorted with rage. "You think this is funny? You think playing games with airline security is amusing?" Her voice rose to a shout that surely carried into the main cabin. "I've got a federal informant trying to spy on Judge Mitchell, and she thinks it's hilarious." The words federal informant and spy hung in the air like grenades about to explode. Keisha realized with dawning horror that Rebecca had constructed an entire conspiracy theory in her mind, with Keisha as the central villain. "Ma'am, please, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding," Rebecca snarled, "is that you thought you could fool me." What happened next would replay in Keisha's nightmares for months to come. Rebecca grabbed Keisha by the shoulders and slammed her against the galley wall with shocking violence. Keisha's head snapped back, striking the metal surface with a sickening thud that echoed through the small space. Stars exploded behind her eyes, but worse was coming. "You're going to tell me the truth," Rebecca hissed, her face inches from Keisha's, spittle flying from her lips. "You're going to tell me who sent you, what you're really doing here, and why you're targeting Judge Mitchell." "I'm not targeting anyone," Keisha gasped, tasting blood where she'd bitten her tongue. "Please, you're hurting me." "I haven't even started hurting you," Rebecca replied, and there was something in her voice that spoke of genuine mental fracture, as if years of resentment and racial prejudice had finally found their outlet. She drew back her fist, and Keisha saw her life change forever in the arc of that movement. The punch came with the full force of Rebecca's body behind it, driven by 12 years of professional frustration, personal failures, and deep-seated bigotry. It caught Keisha on the left side of her jaw with the sound of breaking bone, a wet crack that would haunt the dreams of every passenger who heard it. Keisha's scream tore through the aircraft cabin like a siren, a sound of pure agony that cut through engine noise and casual conversation alike. She crumpled to the galley floor, her jaw hanging at an impossible angle, blood streaming from her mouth and pooling on the pristine airline carpeting. The pain was beyond description, beyond anything she'd experienced in her 23 years of life. Rebecca stood over her, breathing heavily, her hand already swelling from the impact. For a moment, the flight attendant seemed to come back to herself, seemed to realize the magnitude of what she'd done. But instead of helping, instead of showing remorse, she doubled down on her delusion. "That's what happens to federal spies on my aircraft," she declared loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "That's what happens when you try to run surveillance operations at 30,000 feet. The response from the main cabin was immediate and explosive. Passengers began shouting, some in outrage, others in confusion. Mrs. Chun was screaming for help, her elderly voice cracking with emotion. Several people were trying to stand and move toward the galley, but the flight crew was blocking access, unsure whether to support their colleague or distance themselves from her actions. And through it all, Judge Harrison Mitchell was rising from his first-class seat like an avenging angel, his phone recording everything, his face a mask of controlled fury that spoke of justice delayed but not denied. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come, because as Keisha lay on the galley floor, semi-conscious and bleeding, her purse had spilled open during the assault, and a single document had fallen out, a document that would change everything everyone thought they knew about the situation. It was a letter, official and embossed, dated just 1 week ago, and it began with the words, "Dear Ms. Williams, we regret to inform you that your application for witness protection has been denied." The letter fluttered in the recycled air of the galley, visible to Rebecca, to Judge Mitchell, who was now pushing past other passengers to reach the scene, and to anyone else who cared to look closely. Keisha Williams wasn't just a nursing student flying to a medical conference. She was someone who had been desperately seeking protection from the federal government, someone who knew something that had made her a target, someone whose presence on this flight was far more significant than anyone had realized. Rebecca's face went white as she read the first few lines of the letter. Judge Mitchell's expression shifted from outrage to something far more complex as he recognized the official letterhead, the U.S. Marshal Service, Witness Security Program. And Keisha, barely conscious on the floor, was mumbling something through her broken jaw, words that only Judge Mitchell was close enough to hear. "They found me. They said they'd never find me, but they found me." The question that now hung over Flight 447 like a storm cloud was this: was Rebecca Martinez's assault a random act of prejudice and power abuse, or was it something far more sinister? Had someone known about Keisha's witness protection application? Had someone wanted her silenced before she could testify about whatever she'd seen? And most chilling of all, was Rebecca Martinez a racist flight attendant who'd snapped under pressure, or was she part of something much larger and more dangerous? As the aircraft continued its climb toward Chicago, with Keisha bleeding on the galley floor and passengers demanding answers, it became clear that this wasn't just about airline policy or civil rights violations anymore. This was about a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power, a web of corruption that someone was willing to kill to protect, and a young nursing student who had stumbled into the crosshairs of forces she never could have imagined. Judge Mitchell knelt beside Keisha, his judicial training warring with his human impulse to comfort a brutally injured young woman, while Rebecca Martinez stood frozen in place, perhaps finally realizing that she'd been used as a weapon in someone else's war, a war that was just beginning, and one that would tear through the legal system like wildfire before it was over. The chaos that erupted on Flight 447 was unlike anything the veteran crew had ever experienced. Within seconds of Keisha's scream, the aircraft transformed from a peaceful Tuesday morning flight into a flying crime scene with over 200 witnesses. Judge Mitchell was on his knees beside Keisha, his federal authority clashing with aviation protocol as he barked orders at the flight crew while simultaneously calling for medical assistance. "Get me the captain immediately," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades on the federal bench, while Rebecca Martinez stood frozen in the galley doorway, her face cycling through emotions like a broken television: confusion, defiance, fear, and something else that looked disturbingly like relief. Mrs. Chun was sobbing hysterically in her seat, her elderly hand shaking as she tried to call her daughter on her cell phone, while other passengers pushed against each other trying to see what had happened, creating a human bottleneck in the narrow aisle. The lead flight attendant, Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran with kind eyes and graying temples, appeared in the galley entrance and immediately understood that her colleague had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "Rebecca, what have you done?" Maria whispered, but Rebecca's response was what made Judge Mitchell's blood run cold. "I did what I was supposed to do," Rebecca replied, her voice eerily calm now, almost mechanical. "I followed my instructions exactly as given." Maria's face went pale. "What instructions?" "Rebecca, we don't have any instructions about assaulting passengers. This can't be protocol." But Rebecca was staring at something beyond Maria, beyond the chaos, beyond the immediate crisis, as if she were listening to voices only she could hear. "The call came in at 5:30 this morning," she said, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that made several passengers step back. "Priority override from transatlantic security. Watch for the girl in seat 14C. She's dangerous. She's carrying information that could bring down national security operations. Handle it quietly, handle it permanently." Judge Mitchell felt his judicial instincts screaming warnings as he watched Rebecca's mental state deteriorate in real time. This wasn't just racial prejudice or power abuse. This was something else entirely. Someone had programmed Rebecca Martinez like a weapon, pointed her at Keisha Williams, and pulled the trigger. But who had that kind of access to airline security protocols? And what information could a nursing student possibly possess that was worth attempted murder at 30,000 feet? Meanwhile, Keisha was drifting in and out of consciousness on the galley floor, her broken jaw making speech nearly impossible, but she was trying desperately to communicate something. Judge Mitchell leaned closer, straining to understand her mumbled words through the blood and swelling. The children," she whispered, each word sending fresh waves of agony through her shattered face. "The children at Riverside Hospital. They're not sick." Judge Mitchell's heart stopped. Riverside Hospital, he knew that name. It had been in the news recently, praised for its groundbreaking pediatric research program, lauded by politicians and medical professionals alike. But what did Keisha mean they weren't sick? As a nursing student specializing in pediatric care, she would have been working directly with children. What had she seen? "Keisha, can you hear me?" Judge Mitchell said softly, his voice gentle but urgent. "What about the children? What did you discover?" Her eyes fluttered open, focused on him with surprising clarity despite her injuries. The medical trials," she gasped. "They're using foster kids with no families, experimenting on them." The words hit the cramped galley like a bomb blast. Medical experiments on children. Foster children with no advocates, no families to ask questions when they disappeared into the hospital system. Judge Mitchell had seen enough corruption in his career to recognize the shape of a conspiracy, but this was beyond anything he'd encountered. If Keisha had stumbled onto illegal human experimentation, that would explain the witness protection application, explain why someone wanted her silenced before she could testify. But it also raised terrifying questions about how deep this conspiracy reached and who else might be involved. Maria Santos, the lead flight attendant, had heard enough of the conversation to understand that this situation was spiraling beyond anything the airline could handle internally. "I need to contact the ground immediately," she said, But as she reached for the aircraft's communication system, Rebecca Martinez suddenly came back to life with frightening intensity. "No!" Rebecca screamed, lunging toward Maria with the same violence she'd shown toward Keisha. "No ground contact. Those were my instructions. No communication until we land in Chicago." She grabbed Maria by the throat, her manicured nails drawing blood, and for a moment it looked like Flight 447 was about to witness its second assault. But Judge Mitchell was faster than his 68 years suggested. He tackled Rebecca from behind, his weight and momentum sending both of them crashing into the beverage cart with a metallic clang that echoed through the aircraft. Bottles and cans exploded across the galley floor, creating a slippery, dangerous mess as passengers screamed and flight attendants shouted for order. "Get the restraints." Maria gasped, clutching her throat where Rebecca's nails had left bloody scratches. "Get the zip ties from the security kit." But as they struggled to subdue Rebecca, she was laughing now, a high-pitched sound that spoke of complete mental fracture. "You're too late," she cackled. "Do you think I was the only one? Do you think they'd trust something this important to just one person?" Her words sent ice water through Judge Mitchell's veins. Multiple people. A coordinated operation. This wasn't just about silencing one whistleblowing nursing student. This was about protecting a conspiracy so large and valuable that someone was willing to orchestrate attempted murder on a commercial flight to preserve it. As they finally managed to secure Rebecca's hands with zip ties, she looked directly at Judge Mitchell with eyes that were completely lucid despite her apparent breakdown. "You know what the beautiful thing is, Your Honor," she said, using his title with mocking respect. "Even if she lives, even if she testifies, who's going to believe her? A broken little girl with a criminal record against pillars of the medical community." Judge Mitchell's blood froze. "What criminal record? Keisha doesn't have—" "Check again," Rebecca smiled, blood trickling from where she'd bitten her own tongue during the struggle. "Amazing how quickly paperwork can be filed, how quickly evidence can appear. By the time this flight lands, Miss Williams will have an outstanding warrant for drug trafficking. Funny how nursing students sometimes steal medical supplies to sell on the street. Such a shame when promising young people throw their lives away." The pieces of the conspiracy were clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Frame Keisha as a criminal to destroy her credibility as a witness. Arrange for her to be handled during the flight to eliminate the threat permanently. Use Rebecca Martinez as an unwitting weapon, then dispose of her as collateral damage when the job was done. It was efficient, ruthless, and almost perfect. But they hadn't counted on Federal Judge Harrison Mitchell being on the flight, recording everything, seeing through their carefully constructed lies. As Maria Santos finally managed to establish radio contact with the ground, her face went white at the response from air traffic control. "Flight 447, be advised that passenger Keisha Williams has an active federal warrant for narcotics trafficking. Upon landing, she will be taken into custody by federal agents. Additionally, you have reports of a disturbance involving assault charges against the same passenger." Judge Mitchell grabbed the radio microphone from Maria's trembling hands. "This is Federal Judge Harrison Mitchell, identification number 7731. The passenger in question is the victim of a brutal assault by a flight attendant, not the perpetrator. I am declaring this aircraft and all persons aboard to be under federal protection pending investigation of what appears to be a coordinated conspiracy involving witness intimidation and attempted murder." The response from ground control came after a long pause, and the voice was different now, more official, more cautious. "Judge Mitchell, please stand by. We're receiving conflicting information about the situation aboard your aircraft." "I'll bet you are," Judge Mitchell replied grimly. "And I'll bet those conflicting reports are coming from the same people who arranged for this young woman to be assaulted. This is now a federal matter, and I'm ordering this aircraft to divert to the nearest airport with federal law enforcement capabilities. But even as Judge Mitchell was establishing his authority and taking control of the situation, new horrors were unfolding. Keisha, still semi-conscious on the galley floor, was mumbling something else through her broken jaw, something that made Judge Mitchell lean closer with growing dread. The conference. She was saying. The Chicago conference. It's not real. It's a trap. The Chicago nursing conference that had drawn Keisha onto this flight, that had put her directly in harm's way, had been fabricated. Someone had researched her interests, her career goals, her financial situation, and crafted the perfect lure to get her onto Flight 447 where Rebecca Martinez was waiting. But the most terrifying revelation was yet to come, because as Judge Mitchell was processing this information, his phone buzzed with an encrypted message that made his hand shake as he read it. Judge Mitchell, this is Deputy Marshal Sarah Chun. Our sources indicate that Flight 447 is not the target, it's the delivery method. Check the passenger manifest for Dr. Helena Voss, traveling under the alias Margaret Thompson. She's carrying experimental bioweapons research stolen from Riverside Hospital. The assault on Ms. Williams was meant to be a distraction while Dr. Voss transfers the materials to Chicago contacts. You have approximately 90 minutes before landing. The conspiracy reaches higher than you can imagine. Trust no one from ground control. Deputy Marshal Chun, Federal Witness Protection Division. Judge Mitchell's mind reeled as he scrolled through the passenger manifest on Maria's tablet, looking for Margaret Thompson. There, seat 18F, a middle-aged woman traveling alone with only carry-on luggage. Dr. Helena Voss, according to the message, a researcher who had been stealing experimental data from the same hospital where Keisha had witnessed the illegal child experimentation. The conspiracy wasn't just about silencing Keisha, it was about using her as a distraction while much larger crimes were being committed. Someone had orchestrated this entire flight as cover for the theft and transfer of bioweapons research, using a racist flight attendant's prejudices and a vulnerable nursing student as pawns in a game of international espionage. But as Judge Mitchell looked toward seat 18F, his blood ran cold. The seat was empty. Margaret Thompson, Dr. Helena Voss, was nowhere to be seen. She had vanished somewhere between takeoff and the current chaos, along with whatever experimental materials she'd been carrying. The flight attendant assault, the falsified criminal charges, the mental breakdown, the federal complications, all of it had been an elaborate shell game designed to keep everyone's attention focused on the galley while the real prize disappeared into the aircraft's hidden spaces. Judge Mitchell realized with dawning horror that Flight 447 had become something far more dangerous than a flying crime scene. It had become a mobile laboratory where stolen bioweapons research was being prepared for delivery to unknown parties, where innocent passengers were unwitting accomplices to an act of domestic terrorism, and where he, despite all his federal authority, might be powerless to stop what was already in motion. As the aircraft continued its journey toward Chicago, carrying its cargo of secrets, lies, and stolen biological weapons, Judge Mitchell understood that the broken jaw of one nursing student was just the beginning of a nightmare that could endanger thousands of lives and shake the foundations of national security, and that, somehow, in the next 90 minutes, he had to find a way to stop a conspiracy that had been months or even years in the planning. Using nothing but his legal authority and the testimony of a young woman whose credibility was being systematically destroyed even as she bled on the galley floor, the emergency diversion to Cleveland Hopkins International Airport came with complications that Judge Mitchell hadn't anticipated, complications that suggested the conspiracy reached deeper into federal agencies than even he had imagined. As Flight 447 began its descent, the aircraft's communication system crackled with instructions from ground control that made Mitchell's judicial instincts scream warnings. Flight 447, you are ordered to proceed directly to Hangar 7 upon landing. Federal agents will board immediately to take custody of the suspect and conduct interviews with all passengers. No one is to leave the aircraft until cleared by federal security. But Judge Mitchell had spent 3 decades recognizing the difference between legitimate federal authority and manufactured crisis management, and something about the ground controller's tone, the rushed instructions, the insistence on Hangar 7 specifically, felt orchestrated rather than procedural. As he helped Maria Santos tend to Keisha's injuries with makeshift medical supplies from the aircraft's first aid kit, Mitchell noticed that Rebecca Martinez, despite being restrained with zip ties, was no longer showing signs of mental breakdown. Instead, she was watching the aircraft's approach with the focused attention of someone waiting for a predetermined signal. "Maria," Mitchell said quietly, "does Transatlantic typically use Hangar 7 at Cleveland?" Maria's face went pale as she considered the question. "Judge Mitchell, we don't typically use any hangars at Cleveland. This is supposed to be an emergency landing. We should be going to the main terminal gate area, where paramedics and police would have immediate access." The realization hit them both simultaneously. Someone on the ground was trying to control the landing location, isolate the aircraft, and limit access to legitimate law enforcement. Mitchell's phone buzzed again with another encrypted message, but this time the sender identification made his blood freeze. "Judge Mitchell, this is Director James Morrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Deputy Marshal Sarah Chun, who contacted you earlier, was found dead in her Washington office 2 hours ago, apparent suicide. Any communications claiming to be from her are fraudulent. Repeat, Deputy Marshal Chun is deceased. Trust no communications claiming federal authority until you are in direct contact with verified FBI personnel. The situation aboard Flight 447 is part of a larger domestic terrorism investigation. Director Morrison, FBI." Judge Mitchell stared at the message, his mind racing through the implications. If Sarah Chun was dead, then who had sent the earlier message about Dr. Helena Voss and the bioweapons research? Who knew enough about the conspiracy to craft such detailed and convincing intelligence? And most terrifyingly, who had access to encrypted federal communication channels and deputy marshal identification codes? As these questions churned through his mind, a new voice came over the aircraft's intercom system. Not Maria Santos or any member of the crew, but a calm professional male voice that seemed to emanate from the aircraft's public address system itself. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds speaking." But Judge Mitchell knew immediately that something was wrong, because he had seen Captain Reynolds during the initial boarding process, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes. Whoever was speaking was male, younger, and speaking with the kind of clinical precision that suggested military or intelligence training. "Due to security concerns that have developed during our flight, we will be implementing emergency protocols upon landing. All passengers will remain seated with seatbelts fastened until federal agents board the aircraft. Anyone who attempts to leave their seat, use electronic devices, or communicate with persons outside the aircraft will be considered a security threat and handled accordingly." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Judge Mitchell realized that Flight 447 had been compromised from within. Someone, possibly multiple people, aboard the aircraft were part of the conspiracy, and they were now taking active control of the situation as the plane approached Cleveland. But the most shocking revelation came when Judge Mitchell looked up from his phone to find that Margaret Thompson, the woman he now suspected was Dr. Helena Voss, had not vanished at all. She was standing in the first-class aisle, no longer the mousy middle-aged woman who had boarded in Atlanta, but someone entirely different. Gone was the frumpy clothing and nervous demeanor. In their place stood a confident woman in her 40s with sharp intelligence in her eyes and something that looked distinctly like a weapon concealed beneath her blazer. "Judge Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume for the passengers nearby to hear, "I believe you've been looking for me. Dr. Helena Voss, though I suspect you know me by my traveling alias." Mitchell's hand moved instinctively toward his phone, but Dr. Voss shook her head with a slight smile. "I wouldn't recommend attempting to contact anyone just yet. You see, the situation is considerably more complex than you've been led to believe. She gestured toward the galley where Keisha lay semi-conscious, her jaw still grotesquely swollen from Rebecca Martinez's assault. Miss Williams didn't stumble onto our research by accident. She was recruited specifically because of her background, her skills, and most importantly, her psychological profile. Someone who would react with moral outrage to what she discovered, someone who would feel compelled to seek federal protection, someone who would become the perfect unwitting agent in a much larger operation. Judge Mitchell felt the aircraft shudder slightly as it continued its descent toward Cleveland, but his attention was completely focused on Dr. Voss and the implications of what she was saying. You're claiming that Keisha was deliberately exposed to your illegal research? That someone wanted her to discover the child experimentation? Not my research, Judge Mitchell, Dr. Voss replied, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been regret. And not illegal experimentation. What Miss Williams witnessed at Riverside Hospital was a carefully constructed fiction, designed to create exactly the reaction we needed. The sick children she saw were actually child actors, the medical procedures were elaborate theater, and the experimental drugs were nothing more dangerous than vitamins and saline solution. The revelation hit Judge Mitchell like a physical blow. If the child experimentation was fake, then Keisha's witness protection application was based on manufactured evidence. But that raised even more disturbing questions about who had the resources to stage such an elaborate deception and why they would go to such lengths. But the assault, Mitchell said, gesturing toward Keisha's broken jaw. Rebecca Martinez nearly killed her. That's real enough. Oh yes, Dr. Voss agreed, that's very real. Ms. Martinez was never supposed to escalate to physical violence. She was programmed, and I use that term quite literally, to create a scene, to ensure that Miss Williams would be detained and questioned, to establish a paper trail of instability and criminal behavior that would destroy her credibility as a witness. The assault was an unplanned deviation that has complicated our operation considerably. Judge Mitchell's mind was reeling as he tried to process the layers of deception and manipulation. Programmed? You're talking about mind control. I'm talking about advanced psychological conditioning combined with carefully administered pharmaceutical agents, Dr. Voss replied matter-of-factly. Ms. Martinez has been receiving what she believed were anxiety medications from the airline's employee health program. In reality, she was being dosed with experimental compounds that increase suggestibility while amplifying existing prejudices and aggressive tendencies. The morning phone call she mentioned, the priority override from transatlantic security, was simply the trigger phrase that activated her conditioning. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear in all its horrifying complexity. Someone had been running a psychological operation that involved fake medical research, conditioned airline employees, manufactured federal communications, and elaborate deceptions designed to manipulate multiple victims into predetermined behaviors. But Judge Mitchell still didn't understand the ultimate purpose. What's the end goal? He demanded. Why orchestrate something this elaborate just to destroy one nursing student's credibility? Dr. Voss glanced toward the aircraft windows where the lights of Cleveland were becoming visible through the gathering dusk, then back at Judge Mitchell with an expression that mixed professional respect with genuine pity. Because, Your Honor, Miss Williams isn't the target, you are. Everything that's happened on this flight, every piece of evidence you've witnessed, every federal communication you've received, has been designed to place you in a very specific position at a very specific moment. Judge Mitchell felt the world tilt around him as the implications crashed home. The Chicago conference was faked to get Keisha on this flight. Rebecca Martinez was conditioned to assault her. The federal messages were fabricated to guide my responses. All of it to manipulate me into using your federal authority to divert this aircraft to Cleveland Hopkins International Airport, where you will witness the arrest of Miss Williams on fabricated drug trafficking charges, where you will see what appears to be overwhelming evidence of her guilt, and where you will be compelled by your judicial oath to testify that she is mentally unstable, violent, and not credible as a witness," Dr. Voss finished. "You see, Judge Mitchell, there really is a legal medical research being conducted on foster children, and Miss Williams really did discover it. But not at Riverside Hospital, at a facility in Chicago owned by some very powerful people who have significant influence over federal agencies, airline security protocols, and pharmaceutical research programs. When the real whistleblowing comes to light, when the actual evidence surfaces, Miss Williams will be the only witness with direct knowledge of the crimes. And by then, you will have already testified under oath that she is an unreliable, potentially dangerous individual whose testimony cannot be trusted." The elegant brutality of the conspiracy took Judge Mitchell's breath away. They hadn't just tried to silence Keisha Williams. They had orchestrated an elaborate psychological operation designed to turn one of the most respected federal judges in the country into an unwitting instrument of her destruction. Every decision he had made, every action he had taken, had been anticipated and guided by people who understood both his psychological profile and his unwavering commitment to judicial integrity. "The real question now," Dr. Voss continued as the aircraft's landing gear engaged with a mechanical thump that resonated through the cabin, "is what you're going to do with this information. Because in approximately 15 minutes, federal agents, real federal agents this time, will board this aircraft. They will have authentic warrants, legitimate evidence, and valid authority to arrest Miss Williams on drug trafficking charges. The evidence will be convincing enough to fool even experienced investigators, and your testimony about her behavior on this flight will be the deciding factor in whether she's considered a credible witness or a desperate criminal trying to fabricate stories to avoid prosecution." Judge Mitchell looked toward the galley where Keisha Williams lay broken and semi-conscious, a young woman whose only crime had been caring enough about vulnerable children to investigate suspicious medical procedures. She had been manipulated, brutalized, and framed by people with resources and ruthlessness beyond anything he had encountered in 3 decades of federal service. And now they were asking him to become the final instrument of her destruction, to use his reputation and authority to validate their lies and protect their crimes. The aircraft touched down on the Cleveland runway with a jar that seemed to shake everyone aboard, and through the windows, Judge Mitchell could see the flashing lights of what appeared to be a massive federal response. FBI vehicles, federal marshals, even what looked like hazmat teams preparing to board the aircraft. The conspiracy had reached its culmination, and in the next few minutes, Judge Mitchell would have to choose between his judicial oath to follow the evidence wherever it led and his moral obligation to protect an innocent young woman from a system that had been corrupted beyond recognition. As federal agents began surrounding the aircraft and preparing to board, Dr. Voss moved closer to Judge Mitchell and spoke in a voice so quiet that only he could hear. "There is one more thing you should know, Your Honor. The people behind this operation, they didn't choose you by accident either. Your own grandson, Timothy, the one who's been struggling with leukemia at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia? His experimental treatment program, the one that's been so remarkably successful? That research was developed using data obtained from the same foster children that Miss Williams discovered being used as test subjects. Your family's miracle cure came at the cost of dozens of vulnerable children's lives, and if you expose this conspiracy, if you protect Miss Williams and allow her to testify, your grandson will lose access to the only treatment keeping him alive." The words hit Judge Mitchell like bullets, each one designed to shatter his resolve and force him to choose between justice for Keisha Williams and survival for his own family. As federal agents began boarding the aircraft and approaching the first-class section where he sat, Judge Mitchell realized that the conspiracy wasn't just about silencing one witness or protecting one illegal research program. It was about demonstrating that even the highest levels of federal authority could be corrupted, that even the most principled judges could be forced to compromise their integrity when the stakes became personal enough, and that in the end, the system itself could be made to serve the interests of those with sufficient power and ruthlessness to orchestrate such elaborate deceptions. leaving him with an impossible choice that would define not just his legacy as a judge, but his worth as a human being. The federal agents who boarded Flight 447 moved with the precision of a military operation, but Judge Mitchell's 3 decades of experience in federal courtrooms had taught him to recognize the subtle differences between legitimate law enforcement and elaborate theater, and something about these agents felt wrong in ways that made his judicial instincts scream warnings. The lead agent, a tall man in his 40s with a kind of generic federal appearance that seemed designed to be forgettable, approached Judge Mitchell with credentials that looked perfect but felt manufactured. "Your Honor, I'm Special Agent Davidson, FBI. We're here to take custody of Keisha Williams and conduct preliminary interviews regarding the assault incident." But as Agent Davidson spoke, Judge Mitchell noticed that the man's eyes kept flicking toward Dr. Helena Voss, who had positioned herself near the emergency exit with the casual confidence of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. More troubling, Judge Mitchell could see through the aircraft windows that the federal response surrounding the plane included vehicles and personnel that didn't match standard FBI protocols. Too many unmarked vans, too many people in civilian clothing with military postures, too much equipment that looked more suited to a corporate extraction than a criminal arrest. The pieces of the conspiracy were shifting again, revealing new layers of deception that made Judge Mitchell question everything he thought he understood about the situation. As Agent Davidson moved toward the galley where Keisha lay semi-conscious, she stirred and tried to speak through her broken jaw, her words barely intelligible but carrying an urgency that cut through the cabin noise. "Judge Mitchell," she gasped, blood still trickling from her mouth. The children, they're not at Riverside, they're here, on this plane." Judge Mitchell felt his blood freeze as the implications of Keisha's words sank in. He looked around the cabin with new eyes, studying the passengers he had barely noticed during the chaos of the past hour, and began to see details that chilled him to his core. There, in seat 12A, a boy who looked no more than 10 years old, traveling alone according to the manifest but showing signs of recent medical procedures, small bandages on his arms, the telltale pallor of someone who had been heavily sedated, the vacant expression of a child who had been through trauma he couldn't understand. In seat 15F, a girl perhaps 8 years old, also traveling alone, also showing signs of medical intervention, clutching a stuffed animal with the desperate grip of someone who had been separated from everything familiar. Judge Mitchell's heart began racing as he counted 6 children scattered throughout the cabin, all traveling alone, all showing subtle signs of recent medical procedures, all listed on the manifest as unaccompanied minors being transported to family services in Chicago. But there was no family services coordinator on board, no social worker, no indication that these children were part of any legitimate child welfare operation. "Dr. Voss," Judge Mitchell said, his voice carrying the authority of his federal position, but also the quiet fury of a man who was beginning to understand the true scope of the atrocity he was witnessing. "These children, they're the real test subjects, aren't they? Not actors, not theater. Real children who have been subjected to experimental medical procedures, and now they're being transported somewhere for, what? More experiments? Disposal." Dr. Voss's expression shifted from professional confidence to something that might have been genuine regret. "Judge Mitchell, you have to understand, the research is legitimate. These children were already lost in the foster system, already forgotten by society. At least this way, their suffering serves a purpose. The treatments we've developed will save thousands of lives, including your grandsons." But Judge Mitchell was no longer listening to her justifications, because he had noticed something that made his blood run cold. Agent Davidson and his team weren't just there to arrest Keisha Williams. They were systematically moving through the cabin, checking on each of the 6 children, administering what appeared to be injections from small medical kits they carried. The children were being sedated, prepared for transport, treated like cargo rather than human beings. "Stop," Judge Mitchell commanded, rising from his seat with all the authority of his federal position. I'm ordering you to cease all medical procedures on these children immediately. As a federal judge, I'm declaring these minors to be under protective custody pending investigation of what appears to be systematic child abuse and human trafficking." Agent Davidson turned toward Judge Mitchell with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Your Honor, with respect, you have no jurisdiction here. These children are part of a classified medical research program operating under National Security Authority. Any interference with this operation constitutes obstruction of federal security measures." But Judge Mitchell had spent his entire career dealing with people who tried to hide behind false authority, and he recognized the subtle tells that indicated Davidson was operating outside legitimate federal protocols. "Show me the court orders authorizing medical procedures on these children. Show me the documentation proving they are voluntary participants or that their legal guardians have provided informed consent. Show me anything that proves this operation has legitimate oversight from child welfare authorities." Davidson's response was to signal to his team, and Judge Mitchell realized with dawning horror that the federal agents were preparing to remove not just Keisha Williams, but all 6 children, taking them off the aircraft and into the waiting vehicles where they would disappear into a system designed to exploit the most vulnerable members of society. But the situation was about to become even more complex, because Rebecca Martinez, who had been restrained and largely ignored during the federal boarding, suddenly began laughing with the manic intensity of someone whose psychological conditioning was finally breaking down completely. "You idiots!" she screamed, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Do you think I don't know what's really happening? Do you think I don't remember what they made me forget?" Her words caught everyone's attention, including Agent Davidson and Dr. Voss, who both turned toward the restrained flight attendant with expressions of sudden concern. Rebecca's eyes were wild but lucid as she continued, "The pharmaceutical conditioning. I remember the real briefings now, not the fake memories they implanted. This isn't about protecting national security or advancing medical research. This is about harvest operations. These children aren't being used for experimental treatments, they're being harvested for biological materials. Bone marrow, organs, blood, even neural tissue. That's why they need them alive but sedated, why they need to transport them to facilities with surgical capabilities." The revelation hit the cabin like a bomb blast. Human trafficking for biological harvesting, using foster children who had no advocates, no families to ask questions when they disappeared. Judge Mitchell felt sick as he realized the true scope of the atrocity, a systematic operation that identified vulnerable children, removed them from whatever minimal protection the foster system provided, subjected them to medical procedures that would identify the most valuable biological materials they could provide, and then transported them to facilities where they would be harvested. "That's why they needed to destroy Keisha's credibility," Rebecca continued, her voice gaining strength as the artificial conditioning continued to break down. "She didn't just witness fake procedures, she witnessed the preliminary harvesting operations, the tests to determine which children had the most valuable biological compatibility for the buyers waiting in Chicago. She saw children being prepared for organ removal, and when she tried to report it, they realized they needed to silence her permanently." Judge Mitchell looked around the cabin and saw the conspiracy in its full horrifying scope. The children, sedated and compliant, being prepared for biological harvesting. Keisha Williams, brutalized and framed to prevent her from testifying about what she had witnessed. Federal agents who were actually private contractors working for individuals wealthy enough to pay for biological materials harvested from children. An entire operation disguised as legitimate medical research and federal law enforcement, but actually representing the darkest possible exploitation of society's most vulnerable members. Dr. Voss was now speaking rapidly into a satellite phone, clearly communicating with whoever was coordinating the ground operation, but Judge Mitchell could see from her expression that Rebecca's revelation had disrupted their carefully planned timeline. The psychological conditioning that had made Rebecca Martinez a perfect weapon had also made her a potential liability when it broke down, and now she was exposing details that were never supposed to become public knowledge. But the most shocking twist was yet to come, because as Judge Mitchell processed the full horror of what he was witnessing, his phone buzzed with a message that made him question everything he thought he knew about his own role in this conspiracy. The message wasn't from any federal agency or law enforcement organization. It was from his daughter, Sarah, Timothy's mother, and it was time-stamped just minutes before Flight 447 had taken off from Atlanta. "Dad, I need you to know the truth about Timothy's treatment. The experimental program at Children's Hospital. I've been doing research, and I think the biological materials they're using come from other children who didn't survive. I think Timothy's miracle cure is built on something horrible, and I think someone knows that we know. I'm scared, Dad. They've been asking questions about you, about your flight schedule, about cases you're hearing that involve medical research. I think they're planning something. Please be careful, and please don't let them use Timothy as leverage against you. Some things are more important than survival, and you taught me that justice matters more than anything else. I love you, and I trust you to do the right thing, no matter what it costs our family." Judge Mitchell stared at the message, tears blurring his vision as he realized that his daughter had already discovered the connection between Timothy's treatment and the children being harvested, had already accepted that their family's miracle might come at an unacceptable moral cost, and had given him permission, even encouragement, to choose justice over their personal survival. The emotional manipulation that Dr. Voss had attempted, the threat to his grandson's life that was supposed to force him into compliance, had been based on the assumption that he would prioritize family over justice. But Sarah's message revealed that his family had already made the same choice he was facing, had already decided that some prices were too high to pay, even for a child's life. "Agent Davidson," Judge Mitchell said, his voice carrying the full weight of 3 decades of federal authority, "I am hereby ordering the immediate cessation of this operation. These children are to be transferred to legitimate child protective services. Miss Williams is to receive immediate medical attention from certified paramedics, and you and your team are to surrender your weapons and submit to questioning by legitimate federal authorities." Davidson's response was to draw his weapon, confirming what Judge Mitchell had already suspected. These were not federal agents, and this operation had moved beyond any pretense of legal authority. But as Davidson raised his gun, something extraordinary happened. The passengers of Flight 447, who had been watching the drama unfold with growing understanding and horror, began to move. Mrs. Chun, the elderly woman who had befriended Keisha, stood up and positioned herself between Davidson and Judge Mitchell. The businessman from Seat 8A stepped into the aisle, blocking Davidson's line of sight. Other passengers began rising from their seats, creating a human shield around the children and Judge Mitchell, ordinary people who had decided that they could not remain passive witnesses to such absolute evil. "You're outnumbered," Judge Mitchell said to Davidson, his voice steady despite the gun pointed in his direction. "There are over 200 passengers on this aircraft, and they've all heard enough to understand what's happening. Your operation depended on secrecy, on controlling the narrative, on making sure the truth never reached the public. But that secrecy is gone now, and there's no way to put it back." Dr. Voss was shouting into her satellite phone, clearly trying to coordinate some kind of extraction or escape plan, but Judge Mitchell could see from her increasingly frantic expressions that the operation was collapsing around them. The psychological manipulation, the elaborate deceptions, the carefully orchestrated timeline, all of it was falling apart because they had underestimated the power of ordinary people to recognize absolute moral evil and choose to resist it, regardless of the personal cost. As the standoff continued with federal authority facing off against private contractors with weapons, with innocent children caught in the middle and 200 civilian witnesses, Judge Mitchell realized that the next few minutes would determine not just whether justice would be served in this particular case, but whether the system itself could be redeemed from the corruption that had nearly consumed it. and whether the sacrifice of vulnerable children for the benefit of the wealthy and powerful would continue to be tolerated by a society that claimed to value human dignity and the protection of the innocent above all else. The standoff aboard Flight 447 escalated into something that aviation security had never prepared for when Agent Davidson's weapon discharge, whether intentional or accidental in the chaos, shattered the cabin's pressurized atmosphere and sent passengers diving for cover while alarms screamed through the aircraft's communication systems. But instead of creating the panic and confusion that Davidson's team had likely counted on to facilitate their extraction of the children, the gunshot had the opposite effect. It crystallized the resolve of every person aboard who understood that they were witnessing something that would define their moral character for the rest of their lives. Mrs. Chun, the 72-year-old woman who had first befriended Keisha, was the first to act with the kind of courage that comes from having lived long enough to recognize true evil when she sees it. "You will not harm these babies," she declared in accented English made fierce by maternal instinct, positioning herself directly in front of the 10-year-old boy in seat 12A, who was still groggy from whatever sedatives Davidson's team had administered. Her small frame seemed to expand with righteous fury as she faced down armed men who towered over her, but her eyes burned with the kind of fire that had once stared down Japanese occupation forces in Korea decades earlier. Behind her, other passengers were making similar choices. The businessman from seat 8A, who had been absorbed in quarterly reports when the flight began, now stood protectively near the 8-year-old girl with a stuffed animal, his corporate training forgotten in favor of something more primal and necessary. A young mother traveling with her own toddler had moved to shield 2 more of the children, while her husband, a mechanic from Detroit with arms like steel cables, positioned himself between Davidson's team and the rear of the aircraft where 3 more children were seated. But the most unexpected transformation came from Rebecca Martinez herself, who had managed to work free from her zip-tie restraints during the chaos and was now standing in the galley entrance with blood streaming from her face, but with eyes that were clearer than they had been since boarding. "I remember now," she said, her voice carrying across the cabin despite the continued blaring of alarms. "I remember everything they made me forget, every briefing they covered up with their psychological conditioning. This operation, it's not just about harvesting children. It's about proving that they can make anyone complicit in atrocity. They chose me because I had the perfect psychological profile: racial prejudice, professional frustration, authority issues. They needed someone who would assault Keisha Williams with enough violence to establish her as mentally unstable, but they also needed someone who could be programmed to forget the real reasons afterward." Rebecca's revelation sent shockwaves through the cabin because it confirmed what Judge Mitchell had begun to suspect. This wasn't just a criminal conspiracy to harvest children for biological materials. It was a psychological experiment designed to test how far ordinary people could be manipulated into participating in systematic evil. Rebecca had been both perpetrator and victim, her actions both inexcusable and not entirely her own responsibility. "But there's more," Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger as the artificial conditioning continued to collapse. "Judge Mitchell, they didn't choose you just because you were respected enough to destroy Keisha's credibility. They chose you because your grandson's treatment program, it's the test case for treatments derived from harvested materials. If they could get you to participate in covering up the source of his cure, they would have proof that even federal judges could be corrupted when their families were at stake. You were never meant to be just a witness. You were meant to be the ultimate validation of their system." Dr. Voss, meanwhile, was screaming into her satellite phone in what sounded like Russian or Eastern European language, and Judge Mitchell realized with growing alarm that the conspiracy reached beyond American borders, beyond any single organization, into international networks that traded in human biological materials with the casual efficiency of commodity markets. The children on Flight 447 weren't just victims of American corruption. They were products being transported across international boundaries for buyers who valued their biological compatibility more than their humanity. Agent Davidson was speaking rapidly into his own communication device, clearly coordinating with the ground team surrounding the aircraft, But Judge Mitchell could see through the windows that the situation on the ground was changing in ways that suggested their operation was facing complications beyond their control. The unmarked vans that had initially surrounded the aircraft were now joined by vehicles that looked distinctly different: news trucks, legitimate federal agency cars with proper insignia, and what appeared to be representatives from international human rights organizations. "How?" Davidson demanded, his weapon still trained on the crowd of passengers who had formed a protective barrier around the children. "How did they know to be here?" The answer came from an unexpected source: Keisha Williams, who had regained consciousness and was struggling to speak through her broken jaw, blood still trickling from her mouth but her eyes fierce with determination. I recorded everything," she gasped, each word causing visible pain but carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Before the flight, when I discovered the children at the preliminary facility, I recorded everything and uploaded it to secure servers with automatic release triggers. If I didn't check in every 12 hours, if something happened to me, the recordings would be automatically distributed to media outlets, federal agencies, international human rights organizations." Judge Mitchell felt his heart soar with admiration for the young nursing student who had been brutalized and framed, but had still managed to create a failsafe that was now bringing their entire conspiracy crashing down. Keisha had anticipated that they would try to silence her, had prepared for the possibility that she might be killed or discredited, and had created a system that would ensure the truth would emerge regardless of what happened to her personally. "The 12-hour deadline passed 20 minutes ago," Keisha continued, her voice growing stronger despite her injuries. "Every major news network, every federal law enforcement agency, every international human rights organization now has video evidence of children being prepared for biological harvesting, documentation of the facilities being used, names and faces of everyone involved in the operation." Dr. Vasa's satellite phone conversation had become increasingly frantic, and Judge Mitchell could see from her expressions that she was receiving news that confirmed Keisha's revelation. The conspiracy that had seemed so perfectly orchestrated, so completely in control of every variable, was collapsing as the outside world finally gained access to evidence that could not be suppressed, discredited, or explained away. But Davidson's response to this development was what truly revealed the depths of evil they were dealing with, because instead of surrendering or attempting to negotiate, he turned his weapon toward the children themselves. "If we can't complete the operation," he said with the casual tone of someone discussing weather, "then we eliminate the evidence. All of it." The threat to murder 6 innocent children rather than face accountability for their crimes sent a wave of horror through the cabin, but it also triggered something that Judge Mitchell had rarely seen in his 3 decades of federal service: the spontaneous organization of ordinary people into a force for absolute justice. The passengers didn't discuss strategy or debate tactics. They simply moved as one organism, surrounding Davidson's team with a kind of unified purpose that emerges when moral clarity becomes absolute. What happened next would be analyzed by psychologists and security experts for years to come, but in the moment it felt like the natural expression of human decency pushed beyond its breaking point. The businessman from Detroit didn't just shield the children. He advanced on Davidson with the steady confidence of someone who had decided that some things were worth dying for. Mrs. Chen didn't just stand her ground. She began walking toward Davidson's weapon with the serene fearlessness of someone who had already lived a full life and was prepared to spend it protecting innocence. Other passengers joined the advance, not in a mob rush that could be easily controlled, but in a deliberate, measured approach that spoke of shared moral purpose rather than panic or rage. "You'll have to shoot all of us," Judge Mitchell said, rising from his seat and joining the advance toward Davidson's position. "Every passenger on this aircraft. 200 people, including children, elderly grandparents, parents traveling with their families. And even if you do, the evidence is already in the hands of people who can't be bought, threatened, or silenced. The operation is over. The only question now is whether you're going to add mass murder to the charges you're already facing." Davidson's expression shifted as he realized the impossible position he was in. His operation had depended on controlling information, manipulating individuals, exploiting the weaknesses of specific targets. But he was now facing something that couldn't be controlled or manipulated: the collective moral outrage of ordinary people who had witnessed absolute evil and chosen to resist it regardless of personal cost. Dr. Voss had ended her satellite phone conversation and was now staring out the aircraft windows at the growing crowd of legitimate law enforcement, media representatives, and international observers surrounding the aircraft. "Victor," she said to Davidson in English, using what was clearly not his real name, "the extraction teams are not coming. Moscow has decided we're expendable. Washington has already issued warrants for our arrest. The Beijing contacts have severed all communication. We're on our own." Judge Mitchell realized that they were witnessing the collapse of an international conspiracy that had been operating for years, possibly decades, trafficking in human biological materials with the cooperation of corrupted officials in multiple governments. The children on Flight 447 weren't just victims. They were evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of power in multiple countries, crimes that various governments would now have to investigate and prosecute to avoid being seen as complicit. "There is another option," Dr. Voss continued, and Judge Mitchell saw her reaching for something concealed in her clothing. "If we can't complete the operation, if we can't escape accountability, then we ensure that the evidence dies with us." The realization that she was reaching for some kind of explosive device or chemical weapon sent a new wave of terror through the cabin, but it also clarified the choice facing everyone aboard Flight 447. They could attempt to negotiate with terrorists who were prepared to murder children and commit mass casualties rather than face justice, could continue their advance and hope that human decency and courage would prove stronger than weapons and explosives. Judge Mitchell made the choice for everyone by continuing to walk toward Dr. Voss and Davidson, his federal authority now backed by moral authority that transcended any legal jurisdiction. "Dr. Voss," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades spent weighing evidence and dispensing justice, "I've seen a lot of evil in my courtroom, but I've also seen something that never fails to restore my faith in humanity. I've seen ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things when confronted with absolute moral clarity. Today, everyone on this aircraft has that clarity. We know what you've done to those children, we know what you plan to do, and we know that the evidence of your crimes is already in the hands of people who will ensure justice is served. You can kill some of us, maybe all of us, but you cannot kill the truth, and you cannot escape the judgment that's coming." What happened next would be remembered by every survivor as the moment when evil finally met something it could not overcome, manipulate, or destroy: the simple human refusal to allow innocence to be sacrificed for profit, convenience, or the protection of powerful people who believed themselves beyond accountability. And as Dr. Voss's hand moved toward whatever weapon or device she was carrying, 200 ordinary people demonstrated that when moral courage reaches critical mass, it becomes an unstoppable force that can redeem even the most corrupted systems and protect even the most vulnerable victims from predators who mistake complexity for invincibility. The device that Dr. Helena Voss withdrew from her jacket wasn't the explosive or chemical weapon that Judge Mitchell had feared. It was something far more insidious and terrifying: a small aerosol canister connected to what appeared to be a timer and dispersal mechanism, designed to release its contents throughout the aircraft's ventilation system. "Aerosolized compound 77-alpha," she announced with the clinical detachment of someone who had long ago abandoned any connection to human empathy. "Derived from the neural tissue of the first batch of children we processed 3 years ago. Highly concentrated, rapidly dispersing, and designed to cause complete neurological shutdown within 90 seconds of inhalation. Everyone aboard this aircraft will appear to have died from sudden onset respiratory failure. Tragic, but not uncommon at altitude, and easily explained by mechanical failure or pilot error." Judge Mitchell felt his blood turn to ice as he realized they were facing something beyond conventional terrorism: biological warfare using weapons derived from murdered children, deployed by people so morally bankrupt that they would commit mass murder to protect their profits and avoid accountability. But Dr. Voss wasn't finished with her revelations, because as she held the device aloft like a twisted communion chalice, her expression shifted to something that looked disturbingly like religious fervor. "What you don't understand, Judge Mitchell, is that this operation isn't just about biological harvesting or international trafficking. It's about proving a fundamental principle, that human beings are nothing more than sophisticated biological machines, and that once you understand the machinery, you can reprogram it for any purpose." The children weren't just harvested for their organs and neural tissue. They were test subjects for consciousness transfer experiments, for research into uploading and downloading human memories, for projects that will render traditional concepts of individual identity completely obsolete. The revelation sent shockwaves through the cabin because it suggested that the conspiracy reached beyond even the horrific scope they had already uncovered, beyond organ trafficking, beyond biological harvesting, into areas of research that challenged the fundamental nature of human consciousness and individual identity. The children hadn't just been murdered for their biological materials, they had been used as laboratory subjects for experiments in digitizing and transferring human consciousness, turning the most sacred aspect of human existence into just another commodity to be bought and sold. The foster children were perfect test subjects, Dr. Voss continued, her voice taking on the sing-song quality of someone reciting a beloved scripture, because they had no advocates, no families to notice personality changes or memory gaps. We could experiment with partial consciousness transfers, memory implantation, personality modification, even complete identity replacement. Some of the children we harvested are still alive, Judge Mitchell. Their consciousness has been uploaded to digital storage systems, their memories preserved in quantum processors, their personalities backed up like computer files. Death isn't the end anymore, it's just another step in the manufacturing process. But the most terrifying revelation came when Dr. Voss turned her gaze directly to Keisha Williams, who was still struggling to maintain consciousness despite her injuries. Miss Williams wasn't chosen randomly to witness our preliminary operations at the facility she thought was Riverside Hospital. She was selected specifically because her neurological profile matched one of our most successful test subjects, a foster child named Maria Santos, age 8, who underwent complete consciousness transfer before her biological form was harvested. Maria's personality, memories, and cognitive patterns have been stored in our systems for 2 years, and Miss Williams was being evaluated as a potential host for consciousness restoration. Judge Mitchell felt reality tilt around him as he processed the implications. Keisha hadn't stumbled onto evidence of child abuse. She had been selected as a potential vessel for the consciousness of a murdered child, evaluated like a piece of hardware to determine her suitability for having another person's mind downloaded into her brain. The nursing conference in Chicago, the carefully orchestrated flight, even the brutal assault by Rebecca Martinez, all of it had been designed to test Keisha's psychological resilience, her mental stability, her capacity to survive the kind of trauma that would be necessary for consciousness replacement procedures. The assault was never meant to silence her, Dr. Voss explained with the enthusiasm of a researcher discussing a successful experiment. It was meant to create the specific pattern of neurological trauma that would make her brain more receptive to foreign consciousness implantation. Rebecca Martinez's conditioning included detailed instructions for inflicting precisely the right type and degree of injury, enough to damage Keisha's existing neural pathways without destroying her cognitive capacity, creating space for Maria Santos's consciousness to be downloaded into her brain. Rebecca Martinez, who had been listening to this explanation with growing horror and recognition, suddenly began screaming with a sound that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Oh God, what did they make me do? What did they turn me into? She was clawing at her own face now, as if trying to tear away the conditioning that had made her a weapon, the programming that had turned her into an instrument of unimaginable violation. I remember the briefings now, the real briefings, not the cover stories. They told me exactly how to hit her, exactly where to strike to cause the right kind of brain damage. They turned me into a surgeon for consciousness replacement, and I didn't even know it. Judge Mitchell realized that Rebecca Martinez had been as much a victim as Keisha Williams, programmed through pharmaceutical conditioning and psychological manipulation to inflict precisely the kind of neurological trauma that would prepare Keisha's brain for the consciousness of a murdered child. The flight attendant's racial prejudice and professional frustrations had been exploited and amplified, but the specific nature of her violence had been as carefully orchestrated as a medical procedure. But Dr. Voss wasn't finished with her revelations, because she was now looking around the cabin at the other passengers with the appraising gaze of someone evaluating livestock. The beautiful thing about this flight, she continued, is that everyone aboard has been exposed to aerosolized conditioning agents through the cabin's air filtration system for the past 3 hours. Mild doses, just enough to increase suggestibility and reduce resistance to consciousness modification procedures. You've all been softened up, prepared for potential use as host bodies for our stored consciousness data. The implication that every person on Flight 447 had been unwittingly drugged and prepared for consciousness replacement sent waves of horror through the cabin, but it also explained some of the strange behaviors and psychological breakdowns they had witnessed. Rebecca Martinez's conditioning, the passengers' willingness to believe contradictory federal communications, even their collective courage in the face of armed opposition, all of it might have been influenced by pharmaceutical agents designed to alter their neurological functioning. Mrs. Chun, Dr. Voss said, gesturing toward the elderly Korean woman who had positioned herself protectively in front of the children, your psychological profile matches a 12-year-old boy named David Kim, harvested from the Los Angeles foster system 18 months ago. Your age and cultural background make you an ideal candidate for consciousness restoration. We could give David a chance to live again in your body, to experience life through your established social connections and family relationships. Mrs. Chen's response was to spit directly in Dr. Voss's face with a kind of contempt that transcended language barriers and cultural differences. You are sick, she declared in heavily accented English. Sick in your mind, sick in your heart. These children, they are not your products. Their souls are not your property. And I am not your machine. But Dr. Voss was undeterred by Mrs. Chen's defiance, because she was now addressing the businessman from Detroit who had been shielding the children. Mr. Patterson, yes, we know all your names, all your backgrounds, all your psychological profiles. You would be perfect for hosting the consciousness of Tommy Rodriguez, age 10, harvested from the Phoenix foster system. Tommy was particularly bright, showed exceptional aptitude for mechanical systems. We could download his consciousness into your brain, and you could continue your corporate career while giving Tommy the adult life he never had a chance to experience. The systematic way Dr. Voss was matching murdered children with potential adult hosts revealed the true scope of their operation, not just biological harvesting, but consciousness trafficking on an industrial scale, treating human identity and personal experience as commodities that could be extracted, stored, and implanted into new host bodies like software being transferred between computers. But the most shocking revelation came when Dr. Voss turned her attention back to Judge Mitchell himself, her eyes gleaming with a kind of anticipation that suggested she had been saving the best for last. And you, Your Honor, you represent the crown jewel of our entire operation. Not just because your testimony could have destroyed Keisha Williams's credibility, but because your neurological profile is a perfect match for our most important stored consciousness. Federal Judge Sarah Morrison, age 45, who was investigating our operation 2 years ago before she suffered what appeared to be a sudden heart attack in her chambers. Judge Mitchell felt the world collapse around him as he realized that Dr. Voss was claiming that a fellow federal judge, someone he had known personally, someone whose death had shocked the federal judiciary, had been murdered and her consciousness harvested for storage in their digital systems. Judge Morrison discovered the first evidence of consciousness trafficking during a child custody case involving foster children who had been reported missing from our facilities. She was brilliant, relentless, absolutely incorruptible. So we arranged her death and harvested her consciousness before her brain tissue degraded. She's been stored in our quantum processors for 24 months, waiting for the perfect host body. Your body, Judge Mitchell. Your established reputation, your federal authority, your access to classified information and high-security facilities. The implication was staggering. They weren't just planning to murder him. They were planning to replace his consciousness with that of another person, creating a zombie judge who would appear to be Harrison Mitchell but would actually be controlled by the consciousness of Sarah Morrison, modified and programmed to serve their interests rather than pursue justice. Imagine, Dr. Voss continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone describing a beautiful dream, a federal judge with Judge Morrison's brilliant legal mind but modified to serve our interests, operating with your established reputation and security clearances. We could influence legislation, control federal investigations, shape legal precedents for decades to come. The consciousness transfer technology doesn't just let us bring back the dead, it lets us create the perfect infiltrators, people who are legally and genetically identical to their original identities but programmed to serve our purposes. Judge Mitchell realized that they were facing something beyond mere criminal conspiracy. They were confronting a systematic plan to infiltrate and control the highest levels of government, law enforcement, and society through consciousness replacement technology, creating an army of human duplicates who would appear to be legitimate authority figures, but would actually be controlled by the same network that had been trafficking in children's biological materials. The aerosol device in Dr. Voss's hands wasn't just meant to kill everyone aboard Flight 447. It was meant to be the final step in a mass consciousness replacement operation that would turn 200 innocent people into host bodies for stored consciousnesses, creating an entire aircraft full of sleeper agents who would return to their normal lives but would actually be controlled by uploaded minds programmed to serve the conspiracy's interests. The timer on this device isn't set to release poison gas, Dr. Voss announced with triumphant satisfaction. It's set to release concentrated consciousness transfer agents, compounds that will temporarily suppress your existing personalities while making your brains receptive to downloaded consciousness data. Within 6 hours, every person on this aircraft will still look exactly the same, will still have access to their original memories and relationships, but will be controlled by consciousness patterns that serve our interests rather than your own. Judge Mitchell looked around the cabin at the passengers who had risked their lives to protect 6 innocent children, at Mrs. Chun who had faced down armed terrorists with nothing but moral courage, at Rebecca Martinez who was fighting to reclaim her own identity from artificial conditioning, at Keisha Williams who had nearly died trying to expose crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. All of them were about to be transformed into unwilling servants of the very conspiracy they had risked everything to oppose, their heroism and sacrifice twisted into tools for perpetuating the evil they had tried to stop. The device in Dr. Voss's hands began emitting a soft electronic beep, indicating that whatever timer controlled its activation was approaching zero, and Judge Mitchell realized that they had perhaps 60 seconds to prevent not just mass murder, but mass identity theft on a scale that would make every previous atrocity seem small by comparison. The complete replacement of 200 human souls with programmed consciousnesses designed to serve interests that viewed human beings as nothing more than biological hardware for consciousness software, expandable and replaceable components in a system that had industrialized the violation of human identity itself. The electronic beeping from Dr. Voss's consciousness transfer device had reached a steady, urgent rhythm when something extraordinary happened that no one aboard Flight 447 could have anticipated. The 6 children who had been sedated and scheduled for biological harvesting began to wake up simultaneously, not with the groggy confusion of people emerging from pharmaceutical sedation, but with the sharp, focused awareness of individuals who had been pretending to be unconscious while gathering intelligence about their captors. The 10-year-old boy in seat 12A, who had appeared catatonic just minutes earlier, suddenly stood up with fluid precision and spoke in a voice that carried authority far beyond his apparent age. "Dr. Voss, Agent Davidson, this is Special Agent Marcus Webb, Federal Bureau of Investigation, operating under deep cover protocols established by the Department of Justice's Child Protection Task Force. The 6 individuals you believe to be harvested foster children are actually federal agents who have undergone experimental age regression procedures to infiltrate your operation from within. Judge Mitchell felt his understanding of reality fracture completely as he watched the other 5 children also stand and assume positions around the cabin with tactical precision that belonged to trained law enforcement officers, not traumatized kids. The 8-year-old girl with the stuffed animal was now speaking into a concealed communication device. "Command, this is Agent Sarah Martinez, requesting immediate tactical support. We have confirmed multiple federal crimes including conspiracy to commit mass murder, human trafficking, consciousness trafficking, and deployment of biological weapons aboard civilian aircraft." Dr. Voss's expression shifted from triumphant confidence to shocked disbelief as she realized that her carefully orchestrated operation had been compromised from the very beginning by federal agents who had allowed themselves to be subjected to experimental procedures that had literally transformed them into children, creating the perfect deep cover operatives for an investigation that required access to facilities and operations that targeted minors. "Impossible," she gasped, the consciousness transfer device trembling in her hands as the implications crashed home. "The age regression technology doesn't exist. Even our most advanced research hasn't achieved stable physical transformation of adult subjects." "Dr. Voss," said the agent who had appeared to be a 10-year-old boy, his child's voice carrying the professional tone of someone accustomed to briefing federal task forces, "you've been so focused on consciousness transfer and digital identity manipulation that you missed the parallel research being conducted by legitimate federal agencies. Age regression through controlled genetic expression, hormonal manipulation, and cellular regeneration. Technology that allows experienced agents to physically become children while retaining their adult training, knowledge, and investigative capabilities." Judge Mitchell realized that he was witnessing the culmination of a federal investigation that had been years in the making, an operation so sophisticated that it had required agents to sacrifice their adult bodies and identities to gather evidence against a conspiracy that targeted the most vulnerable members of society. The courage and dedication required to voluntarily undergo physical transformation into children, to subject themselves to the same risks and vulnerabilities that real child victims faced, represented a level of commitment to justice that humbled even his decades of federal service. But Dr. Voss wasn't finished yet, because even as she processed the revelation that her victims were actually federal agents, her finger moved toward the activation switch on the consciousness transfer device. "If you're federal agents," she said, her voice regaining some of its earlier confidence, "then you understand the implications of what will happen when this device activates. The consciousness transfer agents will work just as effectively on adult minds and child bodies as they would on normal subjects. You'll become host vessels for the consciousness patterns we've stored, and your federal investigation will become our greatest triumph. Trained FBI agents operating under our control within the federal law enforcement system." Agent Webb, still appearing to be a 10-year-old child but speaking with adult authority, looked directly at Dr. Voss with eyes that burned with righteous fury. "Dr. Voss, what you don't understand is that this entire flight has been a carefully orchestrated federal operation designed to gather evidence and expose the full scope of your conspiracy. The consciousness transfer technology you're so proud of? We've had it for 3 years, developed through legitimate research with voluntary adult subjects who wanted to contribute to law enforcement capabilities. We know how it works, we know how to defend against it, and most importantly, we know how to reverse it." The revelation that the federal government had not only been investigating the consciousness trafficking conspiracy, but had developed defensive countermeasures sent shockwaves through the cabin. Judge Mitchell realized that Flight 447 hadn't been randomly selected as a target. It had been specifically configured as a trap designed to draw the conspiracy's leadership into a situation where they would expose their full capabilities and operational scope while federal agents documented everything for prosecution. "Rebecca Martinez," Agent Webb continued, his child's voice carrying compassion as he addressed the flight attendant who was still struggling with the breakdown of her psychological conditioning. The pharmaceutical agents you've been receiving weren't designed to turn you into a weapon against Keisha Williams. They were designed to make you susceptible to federal counterprogramming that would allow us to monitor the conspiracy's communications through your consciousness. Every order you received, every instruction you followed, was transmitted directly to federal investigators who have been building a comprehensive case against everyone involved in this operation. Rebecca's expression shifted from horror and self-recrimination to confused hope as she processed the possibility that her actions might not have been entirely under the control of the conspiracy. "But I hurt her," she whispered, looking toward Keisha Williams, who was still conscious despite her injuries. "I broke her jaw. I could have killed her." "Ms. Martinez," said Agent Sarah Martinez, the agent who had appeared to be an 8-year-old girl, "the assault you inflicted on Ms. Williams was terrible and traumatic, but it wasn't random violence driven by pharmaceutical conditioning. Every movement you made, every strike you delivered, was guided by federal programming designed to create injuries that would appear severe but would avoid permanent damage. Ms. Williams is a federal agent herself, specially trained to withstand interrogation and assault while maintaining her cover identity. Her injuries are real and painful, but they were anticipated and planned for as part of the operation." Judge Mitchell looked toward Keisha Williams with new understanding and admiration as he realized that the young nursing student who had shown such courage in exposing the conspiracy was actually a federal agent who had volunteered to be brutally assaulted as part of an elaborate sting operation designed to expose crimes against children. Her broken jaw, her blood, her apparent vulnerability, all of it had been real suffering endured for the greater purpose of protecting innocent victims and bringing criminals to justice. But Dr. Voss was laughing now with the manic intensity of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing around them. "You think you've won," she screamed, her finger hovering over the device's activation switch. "You think your federal investigation and your undercover agents and your careful planning changes anything? This device doesn't just contain consciousness transfer agents. It contains the actual stored consciousness patterns of 12 murdered children, including Maria Santos, David Kim, and Tommy Rodriguez. If I activate it, their consciousness will be downloaded into every adult mind on this aircraft. You'll become the children you failed to save, and you'll spend the rest of your lives knowing exactly what it felt like to be harvested for biological materials, while trusted adults did nothing to protect you." The threat to download the consciousness of murdered children into the minds of federal agents and innocent passengers represented a form of psychological torture beyond anything Judge Mitchell had encountered in his career. Dr. Voss wasn't just threatening to kill them, she was threatening to force them to experience the memories, trauma, and death of child victims, to live with the direct knowledge of suffering they had been trying to prevent and avenge. But Agent Webb's response revealed that the federal investigation had anticipated even this final desperate attempt at psychological warfare. "Dr. Voss," he said, his child's voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were facing, "what you don't know is that the consciousness patterns you believe are stored in that device are actually federal decoy data designed to trace the source and scope of your consciousness trafficking network. The device you're holding doesn't contain the consciousness of murdered children. It contains tracking algorithms that will identify every server, every storage facility, every research location connected to your operation when you attempt to activate it. The 12 children whose names you just mentioned? They're not dead, Dr. Voss. They're safe in federal protective custody, and they've been helping us understand your operation for the past 18 months. The revelation that the children believed to be murdered victims were actually alive and working with federal investigators sent Dr. Voss into a state of complete psychological collapse. Her carefully constructed conspiracy, her sophisticated technology, her international network of co-conspirators, all of it had been infiltrated, monitored, and ultimately controlled by federal agents who had used the conspiracy's own methods against it. "Impossible," she whispered, her hands shaking as she stared at the device that she now realized was not a weapon but a trap. "We harvested them ourselves. We processed their biological materials. We stored their consciousness patterns. We used their neural tissue for pharmaceutical development." You processed biological materials from federal laboratories designed to simulate child harvesting operations, Agent Martinez replied. You stored consciousness patterns generated by federal psychologists who understood your research methods. You developed pharmaceuticals from synthetic compounds designed to mimic neural tissue while providing federal chemists with detailed information about your manufacturing processes. Every aspect of your operation that you believed was successful was actually controlled by federal investigators gathering evidence for prosecution. Judge Mitchell realized that they had just witnessed the culmination of perhaps the most sophisticated federal investigation in American history. An operation that had infiltrated a criminal conspiracy at every level, protected innocent victims while appearing to allow their exploitation, and gathered comprehensive evidence of international crimes while preventing actual harm to children. The federal agents who had subjected themselves to age regression, the undercover agent who had endured brutal assault, the investigators who had spent years building false identities and manufacturing fake evidence to mislead criminals, all of it represented a level of dedication and sacrifice that redeemed his faith in the system's capacity for justice. But the story wasn't over yet, because as Dr. Voss stared at the device in her hands with the dawning realization that her entire conspiracy had been compromised, Agent Davidson, who had been silent during the revelations, suddenly began laughing with genuine amusement rather than psychological breakdown. Helena, he said, using Dr. Voss's first name with familiar intimacy, did you really think the federal investigation was limited to the children and the nursing student? Did you think they would overlook the obvious need to have someone monitoring the operation from within the security team itself? Dr. Voss turned toward Davidson with an expression of absolute betrayal as she realized that her most trusted lieutenant, her partner in international consciousness trafficking, her collaborator in the murder and exploitation of innocent children, was also a federal agent who had been working to expose and destroy the conspiracy from within. Agent Davidson, he said, addressing Judge Mitchell and the other passengers while maintaining his weapon in a professional-ready position, Federal Bureau of Investigation, specialized in international trafficking and biological crimes. I've been working undercover within this organization for 4 years, participating in planning sessions, helping to establish operational security, and ensuring that no actual children were harmed during the investigation. Every facility Ms. Voss believes was used for child harvesting was actually a federal training center where agents practiced the procedures and protocols necessary to gather evidence without endangering innocent victims. The scope of the federal operation was staggering in its complexity and thoroughness. Every level of the conspiracy, from the international coordination to the field operations to the individual perpetrators, had been infiltrated and monitored by federal agents who had spent years building comprehensive cases while protecting potential victims from actual harm. Dr. Voss was now completely isolated, surrounded by federal agents who had been posing as her victims, colleagues, and collaborators, holding a device that contained federal tracking software rather than stolen consciousness patterns, operating within a conspiracy that had been controlled by law enforcement from its inception. The beautiful irony, Agent Davidson continued, is that your consciousness trafficking technology actually works exactly as you designed it. The federal government now has complete technical specifications for consciousness transfer, memory implantation, and identity modification procedures that will revolutionize law enforcement capabilities. We can now create undercover agents with perfect cover identities, investigators who genuinely believe their own false backgrounds, and witnesses who can testify about crimes they never actually experienced but remember as if they had lived through them. You've given us tools that will transform how we investigate complex criminal conspiracies, and all of it is legal because it was developed through your illegal research that we've been monitoring and documenting. Judge Mitchell understood that Flight 447 had been more than a federal sting operation. It had been a technology transfer operation designed to acquire advanced consciousness manipulation capabilities for legitimate law enforcement purposes while simultaneously destroying the criminal network that had developed them. The federal government would now possess technology that could revolutionize investigative capabilities while ensuring that the criminals who had developed it through child exploitation would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. And as Dr. Voss finally activated her device in a last desperate attempt to salvage something from the collapse of her conspiracy, the only thing that happened was the transmission of comprehensive data about every aspect of her operation to federal servers that would ensure justice for every victim and accountability for every perpetrator involved in the most sophisticated criminal enterprise in modern history. The activation of Dr. Voss's device created a moment of absolute silence aboard Flight 447 as every person, federal agents, innocent passengers, and criminal conspirators alike, held their breath waiting to discover whether consciousness transfer technology would succeed in overriding their identities or whether federal countermeasures would protect them from digital psychological assault. But instead of the expected hissing sound of aerosol deployment or the electronic hum of consciousness transfer activation, the device simply displayed a message in stark green text: Federal evidence collection complete. All data transmitted. Operation Nightingale concluded successfully. Thank you for your service. The relief that washed over the cabin was palpable, but Judge Mitchell realized that the true scope of what they had witnessed was only beginning to emerge as Agent Webb, still appearing to be a 10-year-old child, began explaining the full magnitude of the federal operation that had culminated aboard Flight 447. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Webb announced, his child's voice carrying the authority of someone briefing a federal task force, "over the past 4 years, Operation Nightingale has successfully infiltrated and dismantled what federal investigators now recognize as the largest international human trafficking and consciousness manipulation network in recorded history. The evidence gathered through this investigation has identified 847 criminal participants across 23 countries, documented the rescue of 312 children who were targeted for biological harvesting, and provided comprehensive technical specifications for consciousness transfer technology that will be used exclusively for legitimate federal law enforcement purposes." But the most shocking revelation was yet to come, because as Agent Webb continued his briefing, Judge Mitchell began to understand that his own presence aboard Flight 447 had been orchestrated not to manipulate him into destroying Keisha Williams's credibility, but to ensure that the federal investigation would have the oversight and validation of one of the most respected federal judges in the country. "Your Honor," Agent Webb said, addressing Judge Mitchell directly, "your grandson Timothy's experimental treatment program was never connected to illegal biological harvesting. His medical care has been provided through legitimate federal research programs that use only voluntary adult donors and synthetic biological materials. The story about his treatment being derived from harvested children was part of our psychological operation designed to test Dr. Voss's willingness to use personal threats against federal judges. We needed to document her methods of corruption and intimidation, and we needed a witness whose testimony would be absolutely unimpeachable when this case comes to trial." The revelation that Timothy's medical treatment had been legitimate all along, that Judge Mitchell's agonizing moral choice between family and justice had been based on manufactured dilemma designed to expose criminal methods rather than actual ethical conflict, brought tears to his eyes as he realized that his grandson's life had never actually depended on the suffering of other children. The federal investigation had been so thorough that it had even anticipated and countered the emotional manipulation tactics the criminals would use against law enforcement officials and their families. "Agent Williams," Agent Webb said, addressing Keisha despite her injuries, "your performance throughout this operation has been exemplary. Maintaining your cover identity while enduring genuine physical assault, providing credible emotional responses that convince the criminals of your authenticity, and gathering comprehensive evidence of criminal psychology and operational methods, all while knowing that your injuries were necessary to establish the credibility of our investigation. Your sacrifice has helped save hundreds of children and will prevent thousands more from becoming victims of consciousness trafficking operations." Judge Mitchell looked at Keisha Williams with profound admiration and respect, understanding now that her broken jaw and traumatic injuries had been endured not by an innocent nursing student who had stumbled into a conspiracy, but by a federal agent who had volunteered to be brutally assaulted as part of an undercover operation designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Her courage in maintaining her cover while being beaten, her commitment to the investigation despite genuine pain and fear, represented the highest ideals of federal service and personal sacrifice for the greater good. Rebecca Martinez, meanwhile, was experiencing her own revelation as the federal agents explained that her pharmaceutical conditioning had been designed not to turn her into a weapon, but to make her susceptible to federal monitoring and control. Ms. Martinez, Agent Sarah Martinez explained, and Judge Mitchell realized the shared surname was not a coincidence. You are my biological aunt, and your recruitment into this operation was part of a multi-generational federal law enforcement family's commitment to bringing down this criminal network. The pharmaceutical conditioning you experienced was designed by federal chemists to make you believe you were acting under criminal control, while actually following federal programming that ensured your actions would gather evidence without causing permanent harm to Agent Williams. Your family has been working to expose this conspiracy for over a decade, and your participation, even though you weren't consciously aware of it, has been crucial to our success. The revelation that Rebecca Martinez had been part of a federal law enforcement family, that her apparent psychological breakdown and violent conditioning had actually been carefully orchestrated federal programming designed to infiltrate the criminal network while protecting innocent victims, transformed her from a perpetrator of racial violence into an unwitting hero whose sacrifice had helped expose international crime. Judge Mitchell realized that every person aboard Flight 447 had been selected and positioned with careful precision to create the perfect environment for gathering comprehensive evidence against a criminal conspiracy that had threatened children around the world. But the most profound transformation came as the federal agents began reversing the age regression procedures that had allowed them to pose as children, using medical equipment that had been concealed throughout the aircraft's cabin during the investigation. Judge Mitchell watched in amazement as the 6 children underwent rapid physical transformation back to their adult forms, experienced federal agents in their 30s and 40s who had sacrificed years of their lives and their adult identities to protect innocent victims and gather evidence against criminal enterprises that exploited the most vulnerable members of society. Agent Marcus Webb, who emerged from the age regression reversal as a 38-year-old man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering, addressed Judge Mitchell with the weary satisfaction of someone who had completed a mission that had consumed years of his life. Your Honor, over the past 4 years, federal agents have subjected themselves to experimental procedures, endured psychological conditioning, accepted false identities, and risked their lives and sanity to gather evidence against criminal networks that treated children as biological commodities. The technology we've acquired through this investigation will be used exclusively to enhance legitimate law enforcement capabilities, and the criminals we've identified will face federal prosecution that will ensure they never again have the opportunity to harm innocent victims. Dr. Helena Voss, meanwhile, was experiencing the complete collapse of everything she had believed about her criminal organization, her technological achievements, and her own importance within international criminal networks. Every facility you believed was processing children for biological harvesting was actually a federal training center where agents learned to simulate criminal procedures while protecting real victims. Every consciousness pattern you thought you had stored was actually federal data designed to trace your network and gather evidence. Every technological breakthrough you achieved was monitored and documented by federal scientists who ensured that the research would be used for legitimate purposes rather than criminal exploitation. But the final revelation, the one that would haunt Dr. Voss for the rest of her life in federal prison, came when Agent Davidson revealed that her entire recruitment into the consciousness trafficking network had been orchestrated by federal investigators who had identified her as a brilliant scientist whose moral flexibility made her the perfect target for a long-term undercover operation. Helena, Agent Davidson said, using her first name with the familiarity of someone who had worked closely with her for years. Do you remember the job offer you received from the pharmaceutical company that first introduced you to consciousness transfer research? Do you remember the research grants that funded your early experiments? Do you remember the international contacts who provided you with equipment and facilities for your operations? Dr. Voss's expression shifted from defeat to absolute horror as she began to understand the implications of what Agent Davidson was suggesting. Every step of your criminal career, he continued, from your initial recruitment to your international networking to your technological development to your operational planning, has been guided and monitored by federal investigators who needed to understand how criminal networks exploit vulnerable populations and develop illegal technologies. You weren't the brilliant criminal mastermind running an international conspiracy. You were the unwitting subject of a federal investigation that used your talents and ambitions to map and dismantle criminal networks while developing defensive capabilities for legitimate law enforcement agencies. The scope of Operation Nightingale's success became clear as federal agents throughout the aircraft began revealing evidence they had gathered: comprehensive documentation of international criminal networks, technical specifications for consciousness transfer technology that would revolutionize law enforcement capabilities, detailed profiles of 847 criminal participants who were being arrested simultaneously around the world, and most importantly, confirmation that 312 children who had been targeted for biological harvesting were safe in federal protective custody and would be reunited with loving families who had been carefully screened and prepared to provide the support and care necessary for recovery from trafficking trauma. Judge Mitchell realized that Flight 447 had been more than a federal sting operation or a criminal investigation. It had been a transformative moment in the history of law enforcement, a demonstration that even the most sophisticated criminal networks could be infiltrated and defeated by federal agents willing to sacrifice their own identities, endure personal trauma, and commit years of their lives to protecting innocent victims and upholding justice. As the aircraft completed its approach to Cleveland Hopkins International Airport, where legitimate federal law enforcement teams were waiting to process evidence and provide medical care for the agents who had been injured during their undercover operations, Judge Mitchell looked around the cabin at the extraordinary people who had participated in Operation Nightingale. Federal agents who had undergone experimental procedures to become children, investigators who had endured brutal assault to maintain their cover identities, undercover operatives who had spent years infiltrating criminal networks while ensuring no actual harm came to innocent victims, and ordinary passengers who had demonstrated the kind of moral courage that emerges when decent people are confronted with absolute evil. The 6 children who had appeared to be trafficking victims were now revealed as federal agents whose sacrifice had saved hundreds of real children from exploitation and death. Keisha Williams, despite her genuine injuries, had maintained her cover identity and gathered crucial evidence while enduring trauma that would have broken most people. Rebecca Martinez had discovered that her apparent psychological conditioning had actually been federal programming designed to use her family connections and personal struggles as weapons against criminal networks. Dr. Helena Voss and her co-conspirators had unknowingly spent years providing federal investigators with comprehensive intelligence about international crime while believing they were building criminal empires. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Webb announced as the aircraft touched down with the gentle bump of a routine landing that belied the extraordinary events of the past few hours, "Operation Nightingale has concluded successfully. The criminal network that threatened children around the world has been exposed and dismantled. The technology that was developed through illegal research will be used exclusively for legitimate federal purposes. The victims who suffered during this investigation will receive comprehensive medical care and support services. And the 312 children who were targeted for biological harvesting are safe and will be reunited with families who will provide them with the love, care, and protection they deserve." Judge Mitchell felt a profound sense of gratitude and amazement as he realized that what had appeared to be a routine flight from Atlanta to Chicago had actually been his participation in one of the most important federal law enforcement operations in American history. An investigation that had protected hundreds of innocent children while demonstrating that justice could triumph over even the most sophisticated forms of evil when dedicated people were willing to sacrifice personal comfort and Safety for the greater good of protecting the vulnerable and upholding the principles that make civilization possible. As federal medical teams boarded the aircraft to provide care for the agents who had been injured during their undercover operations, and as media representatives gathered to document the conclusion of an investigation that would revolutionize public understanding of federal law enforcement capabilities, Judge Mitchell knew that he had witnessed something that would restore public faith in the system's capacity to protect innocent victims and hold criminals accountable regardless of their wealth, sophistication, or international connections. The broken jaw that had started this story would heal. The children who had been threatened would grow up safe and loved. The criminals who had exploited the vulnerable would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. And the technology that had been developed through illegal research would be used to protect rather than exploit future victims, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, justice and human decency could prevail when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things in service of protecting innocence and upholding the principles that define a civilized society. What did you think of this incredible story of justice and courage? Have you ever witnessed ordinary people doing extraordinary things to protect others? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories that will restore your faith in humanity's capacity for good. Tomorrow we'll have another incredible story that will blow your mind, so make sure you hit that notification bell.